Okay, well, I mean, it's very nice of you to invite me here. It's a very old paper, and it's very nice that it's being resurrected for this forum. And I guess it has, you know, some resonances, of course, with what's going on in today, with a lot of your work as well. So Evan didn't ask me to really prepare anything. I should just say, I suppose I've been very influenced recently working with colleagues in biosciences here in Exeter who keep telling me there's no such thing as a pathogen, which you know, seems a really interesting thing for bioscientists to say, and that we're, you know, all disease is a kind of relational accomplishment. And if the ontology shifts from that disease, that kind of, so I suppose the point of the paper is that One Health kind of invites a particular version of reality, which is that disease kind of conforms to what we all know comes from a version of germ theory. And I think Kunguworm said it many years ago, that, you know, making visible the pathogen was kind of a particular way of addressing disease and health. But when you shift the ontology, if you like, as is happening in biosciences at the moment, away from the pathogen towards health, and that's partly response to the post-genomics that are going on and the kind of methodologically driven aspects of what's going on in biosciences. And of course, within the vets and the farms that I've been going on to, the shift towards animal health rather than just disease, then you have this sort of mix where it becomes obvious, I think, that we live in more than one world. We don't live in that kind of billiard table of things banging into each other and causing known effects. It's a much more folded and spatially, I think, complicated world than the One Health model tends to suggest in this form. So I guess that's the point of the paper. But I'd be interested in, you know, responses, questions, and so on. I don't think I can say much more than that at the moment.
I just got Zoom bombed in addition to my internet going in and out. So other folks should please jump in. And I think, you know, what you were just teasing out is one of the really important things I took away from the paper, that it's you know, not a transmission or contact concern that's kind of being unraveled here, but it's an approach building on Rosenberg's notion of configuration to figure out all these practices and multiple worldings that are coming together to make the context. So I'd love to hear more, you know, how you're thinking shifting here. And it seems like, you know, a lot of this paper is about imagining the pandemic to come, and now we're in it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about, you know, having inhabited this world of avian influenza, what things look like in your world as they relate to SARS-CoV-2.
Well, before I go to that, I suppose one way this work has developed in particular, I've been working for the past few years since this paper was published in Bangladesh, to a certain extent in India, and I've been very critical of the rollout of a single model of what modern agriculture looks like, and modern biosecurity, if you like, and a kind of One Health model. So one in particular example, and in fact it's just come out today in Theory, Culture and Society. I've just done a paper on using a bit of Warwick's work as well, post-colonial global health and antimicrobial resistance. And one of the kind of answers to AMR, which has been I guess is the other pandemic to come in some ways, has been to seek to modernize agriculture. So I've got a colleague working in Bangalore in India looking at poultry farming, for example, where a lot of poultry farmers have emerged in the last decade or so because of the failure of arable crops because of climate change. So then there's a shift into keeping chickens, which seems highly profitable, but a lot of farmers don't really know much about chickens, so they tend to be dosing their chickens all the time with antibiotics as a way of keeping them healthy. They're also using breeds that are not really very well adapted to the climate, etc. And now increasingly being told as a way to remove disease and to stop the process of, or the habit, if you like, of using large amounts of antibiotics, is that they're being encouraged to build enclosures to take the chickens inside, etc. But that introduces them to a whole set of capital outlays, including air conditioning, because as soon as you bring the chickens inside in Bangalore, basically you get heat exhaustion and all the other kinds of things, which means they're using more antibiotics. So that's one example. The other, I've been working with aquaculture farms in Bangladesh, and they're being encouraged to use disease-free seeds, so fingerlings and larvae for their shrimp, prawn, and tilapia, etc. The interesting thing, and they're being encouraged to do monoculture as a way of being biosecure. The interesting thing we've found is that actually what you're doing is you're reducing the burden of disease risk, but at the same time, you're increasing the burden of livelihood risk. So because they're doing monoculture, what these farmers were used to doing was kind of putting a few seeds in every month in order to adjust to the fact that the water was changing in temperature, salinity, and so on. They were kind of tinkering, if you like, in our terms, with their farms and making a livelihood out of it, sometimes an okay livelihood. When you introduce them to monoculture and you have a batch system where they produce one set of animals over a period of time, you might, in fact, we've shown with the epidemiologists and the biologists that the disease burden goes down a little bit. So you do reduce, because you're messing around with pond less, you'd expect a little reduction in disease. But what you're doing is increasing the burden of, if disease comes in, basically the farmers have got nothing because they're not topping up every month. Basically, you lose the whole, it's all your eggs in one basket kind of story. So actually they're more likely to use antibiotics because of that, because they're more frightened of losing everything. So you reduce the burden of disease, but you increase the burden, the economic burden of loss. So for me, that's a really good example of when you start to bring these worlds together of livelihood, disease, and so on, what looks like the obvious solution, which is reduce transmission, reduce the disease burden, actually can have a whole set of other relationships. So the economic, the cultural, and so on start messing around with that, if you like. So that's the kind of key point, I suppose, in terms of taking this forward and working in the global south as well as the work we do in the global north. So that kind of export model of One Health, it's not just a kind of, as you say, kumbaya. There's actually a kind of, I think I say in this paper, you're talking about two worlds here. You're talking about the virtuous and the non-virtuous, or the kind of ill-informed. In the paper I've just done a theory called Society, I used Nicholas King's nice article from 20 years ago about that kind of version of global health, of integrated markets, integrated systems. And that for me is a worry. That singularity of One Health becomes the only way of dealing with a problem. So it invites all those kinds of versions of modernism in, and I guess. In terms of COVID, well, maybe other people are more expert than me to talk about it, but I do think that kind of principle of, this is more than transmission. I'm living on an island where clearly we've got so much wrong around governance, around understanding the processes of intensifying a disease, that there's a lot more to health than the transmission of a pathogen. Of course, that's important, but it's not the only thing. But maybe other people want to come in on that kind of issue.
Thank you for unraveling all that. I also have one kind of abstract theoretical question. I think in a line, you kind of nail a really important idea to talk about worlds that are more than one, but less than many, in dialogue with Anne-Marie Moll's Body Multiple. For me, her work has always been very influential in when we were back in the day trying to sort of codify what came to be called multi-species ethnography. I was thinking of species multiples alongside body multiples. And I was wondering if you could just unravel that line a little bit. What is a world that is more than one, but less than many?
It's I think well, again, like you, I'm very influenced by Anne-Marie Moll, and that I suppose the point is I think I wanted to just unpack multiple a bit, and as she does, I'm sure, and John Law as well in particular, and that's to, I suppose, to uncouple plural and multiple a little bit. So their argument, I think, comes from a distinction between what they call epistemological politics, which is that, the plural for them is a way of looking at the same thing from many angles, and that's what they want to get away from. So this isn't about, that there's more than one kind of culture that looks upon disease or health differently, and we get that kind of that old story, if you like, of either epistemological relativism or an eventual gradation to the same biomedical or other dominant view of health and disease. I think what that pragmatogeny, or that sense of this is about the kind of muddling through the patterning of practices, is to perform, or to think about a multiple as a set of interferences, so that we're all playing with the same thing. Yes, there's a shared view in the kind of participants in that research for One World, One Health, of a kind of similar-ish object, but that object isn't kind of anything. It's not it's not that every view has its independent object. It's that those views and those ways of practicing health and disease produce a kind of object that's pushed and pulled in various ways. And I think that the line that's a very actor network theory line, that isn't it, that's the sort of more than one, less than many, is to get you into that, instead of thinking of plural, to think of fractions, and to think of that kind of sense of being pushed and pulled in various directions. And depending on how those kinds of political struggles turn out, will shift the object in other directions. So I think it's to suggest a kind of material and social adherence to a similar kind of world. So it's a form of realism, I guess, but it's one that accepts that world will be stretched in different ways. Does that make sense? So well, that's my understanding of it anyway. And it seems useful to me when I'm working, and of course, what the good thing about One Health is it starts to invite people from different disciplines to work together, and it's useful to have that sense of there's a cohesion, but it's not cohesive, if you like, I guess.
Thanks, that was really helpful. And again, if anybody else wants to jump in, either just put a question in the chat or unmute yourself and go about it that way. Maybe one more sort of sticking with a Moll idiom, a praxiographic question. You talk a little bit about how surveillance is enacted, the sort of practices of sampling serology, looking for traces of previous infections, also the new pigs that come in that are both sort of kept to the side to make sure that they're not bringing new bugs in, but then also sort of bathed in filth to acquaint them with the microbial ecologies of particular facilities. I would just love to hear more about that praxeography of surveillance that's so high cost that you've seen either with this work in the poultry industry or
yeah, well, it's a while ago now with the field work for this, but I spent time in a national surveillance laboratory doing the serology, on a lab bench and going through that process, and also doing the PCR. Well, I say doing, I mean, I kind of was hanging around, not being very expert, but I mean, I was in the lab watching and kind of doing some menial tasks. When it comes to doing the PCR, that was for the national avian influenza surveillance. So that was a piece of active surveillance where I went into the field. We caught wild birds, wild wetland birds, and did kind of survey days. So you'd be working for a few days at a wetland reserve, catching pretty much everything, swabbing it, sending the swabs off, and then I'd follow that into the laboratory and look at the kind of process basically looking for matrix genes, so molecular signals that we had avian influenza. And like, I mean, it's now become obvious. I think it was a kind of a steep learning curve for me, but again, going back to the current crisis, the kinds of imperfections of testing, the difficulties of testing, the kinds of ways in which you choose particular segments of a protein coat of a virus, or in serology, you kind of rely on antibodies being present, and of course, what kind of signal that gives you, depending on what else is going on in people's bodies, whether there's been vaccination, all that kind of thing. So the complexity of those signals was what really struck me in this kind of skill. It's not that it's kind of again, it's not, there is no kind of shared object here. The point is that it takes a lot of skill and a lot of interpretation. And of course, there's a lot of noise and a lot of uncertainty. So that was one element of it. I think the pig in, obviously as an English person, we have the phrase pig, happy as a pig in shit. And the pig in shit was a kind of, that was a kind of fieldwork moment for me, where you kind of realize that, biosecurity isn't what it's made out to be. I have a lovely, actually the company never allowed me to use it, but I've got a lovely image of so it's an image of someone backlit. So there's a bright light behind them, their hands are out like this, and they have a pig, perfect, clean pig, and it said, "This is biosecurity," and that's one of the breeding companies, to show you what I call the immaculate conception of the pig, if you like. The fact that pig is then completely just, a bucket load of pig poo is poured on its back as soon as it arrives on the farm, gives you a strong sense of the kind of immunity that's required in order to survive on a pig farm. So to me, that was a kind of real indication of the modern is not quite how we, it's always patched together. There's endemic diseases that you need to make sure that your pig is already has. So I guess there's two different issues there. One is the difficulty of surveillance, and it's and then it's all wrapped up. I've got a PhD student at the moment doing this in Brazil, talking about vigilancia and emergencies and so on, post Zika and pre-yellow fever, and the whole kind of issues around how emergence doesn't necessarily get turned into emergency because of the difficulty of the political and the cost implications of doing surveillance well. It's not a simple presence absence issue. There's an awful lot of kind of work that goes on. So yeah, I think they're really two important issues, and I think they do speak to the current, or certainly surveillance one speaks to the current moment as well.
Yeah, and there's another line where you're taking inventory of the intricate and continuously changing knots of animals, people, viruses, and economies with which it's difficult to keep pace. And it seems like on the one hand, there's this tendency to try to identify particular agents and isolate and guard against that specificity, but it's the dynamism that the system's unable to account for or contain.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's difficult to know what everyone agrees with you when you say this kind of thing. It's very easy, and I guess this speaks to the kind of issue as I guess we're most humanities and social science people, is we can do that complexity very well. My current bugbear is that so what do we do? How do we do this better? And it doesn't take I'm not a kind of die-in-the-wall Marxist, but it doesn't take a genius to say, surveillance doesn't take into account extraction and exploitation. And if you've got that, you've got kind of unhealthy conditions in many ways. And that's the most obvious thing when you go on a lot of farms and do a lot of work, is that there's more to life than just bugs, and we can add in all those other things. I guess it's what the answer is then, and that's it's the tractability of our knowledge that becomes the key issue. And I sit on some, government panels, and I've got one this week where I'm trying to trouble their version of transmission and modelling as the only thing that matters. But obviously, when you're serving on those government panels, you're in the world of politics, and they don't want to hear about politics of food and kind of upsetting, the big five chicken integrators in the country, or effectively the handful of big pork producers. So there is a real politics to this, and a difficulty of converting social science knowledge into policy, which I think is a real headache. If anyone's got the answer to that, that would be really good.
Could I follow up on that?
So in the comments, Ole, I'm not sure if I'm saying your name right, but you've got an interesting comment about sheep poop, and also a question about the partiality of knowing animal health. Do you want to ask it?
Yeah, sure. Sorry for video off. I'm multitasking with my compost at the moment. I was curious. Let me see what I said. I think I wrote it better. I'm curious about the extent to which we could know, for example, pig health, if that knowledge is also contingent on our knowledge of, other microorganisms that are in the soil, other viruses, pig health. And it seems to me that that gets at this idea of fractions versus multiples that you were talking about previously. And I'm just wondering how that interspecies, interorganism interaction complicates the one world, one health idea. Thanks.
It's a great question. There's been some great histories of pig production, haven't there? In recent, a few have come out, tending to go for the title of capitalist pigs, which I wish I'd thought of. But anyway, that's. But you're right. I mean, it's kind of interesting. There's an interesting history of taking soil out of pig enclosures. So when I think in the early 20th century, when people started to put pigs inside, and invariably started to kind of put them on slatted or concrete floors and so on, they the pig husbandry, they're often called stockmen, but again, stock people, started to introduce sods of soil into those enclosures in order that the pigs would be inoculated in the way that I've described and the way about. So there's clearly been this kind of set of knowledges around the microbiomes within environment and within guts that is a kind of folk knowledge. Increasingly, they're being replaced by probiotics, electrolytes, all these kinds of feed additives. So there's a huge growth, I guess, in that kind of capitalization of animal health. So that's part of it. This isn't a kind of uncontested or neutral terrain in some ways. So I guess that's really important. But I think clearly I'm not representing, and this was 6 years ago since I wrote this. A lot's gone on in the One Health world since then, and I think now, if you did a review of it, there would be some people and some writers and scientists who are starting to introduce the microbiological complexities of biomes and so on into that kind of world. In fact, I'm working with some bioscientists in the homestead palms or gears in Bangladesh, and we've been doing metagenomic analysis of ponds, and we've started to use a French biological term, the pathobiome, to talk about. It's not the presence or absence of pathogens that matters, it's the kind of microbiome of the farm. So if you've got a disease like white spot in your pond, which when we sample, virtually every pond in Bangladesh has this disease, it clearly, but not every pond has animals that are ill, of course. So the point is then, what else is going on within those ponds in terms of the mediation of the microbiological populations and the animals. And I've tried to kind of get the biologists to talk about the socio-biome, in the sense that it depends on how the farmers interacting with markets, how they're harvesting, what kinds of practices they're doing. That affects the microbiology of the pond as well. So there's a lot going on here that, yes, we are making it more complex and starting to think about health as a kind of achievement, which includes the kinds of things you talked about. Does that answer your question? I might have missed something. I'm sure I've missed something.
See a thumbs up.
Okay, good.
So we've got some questions stacking up in the chat from Roberta, Katrina, and then Cesar.
Do you want me to, Katrina, do you want to read it out? Or
Yeah, I can. I was just interested in, I've only had a brief period where I've looked at animal health matters. It's not my main area, but I was getting the impression that lots of the work that was done was still focused around, you know, say viruses and guts, and not necessarily to do with mental health aspects of the humans. And every time I was looking at anything to do with farmers and biosecurity, that seemed to be a big element of what was happening. And I don't know if you've any thoughts on that, or whether that's something the One Health debate really engages with, or whether it's you know, kind of neck down focus.
No, I think no, it's a great question. Someone like Melanie Rock in University of Calgary has done quite a lot of work, and there are others. Chris Degling in Australia and others have talked about or thought about particularly companion animals within the One Health area, and a lot of that, of course, has got to do with mental health in particular, so pets, etc. But the other thing I'd just say, there's a lot more to this, and people are talking about that, and those two authors, I think I'd reference to them. The other thing I would just say is that we did some work here in the southwest of England, because we've had a animal health issue for many, many decades now called bovine tuberculosis, which is a wildlife disease in badgers and then into cattle. We've had numerous farmer suicides over this, and a part of that issue has been the added burden of responsibilizing farmers for their biosecurity. So if your farm goes down with BTB, it's a massive problem. Okay, you because of the nature of the testing and all sorts of other things, you're basically out of the market for many months, possibly years. So that's a big issue, and clearly has massive social repercussions in terms of family farms and businesses. But the added burden of effectively the government taking away or starting to threaten to take away compensation from those farms who get disease if their farms are found not to have implemented the right biosecurity is one of the key issues. So, you know, this kind of version of disease over here, health over here, responsibilizes certain agents, a bit like public health, and making us all, you know, giving us all the power to be responsible for our own health, while taking away the power and the kind of, you know, the jobs we do or whatever else. So that kind of argument. So there's a similar sort of set of issues there. I don't know if that's been developed enough. So I think there's a real opportunity to kind of muddy the waters. And as you say, you've got a lovely line there of kind of One Health has tended to be and has come from that emerging zoonosis moment, and it has expanded into a broader conception of health, which includes mental health, but I think there's a long way to go.
Roberta.
Yes, thanks. Thank you for this. I'm interested about your relationship with your One Health colleagues, also in light of what you have called somewhere else healthy communities. You know, I strongly believe in this concept of creating collaboration also with bioscientists. So I was wondering which was and what is the reaction of your interpretation of One Health among your colleagues?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's mixed. I think on the one hand, I find the biologists easiest to work with, and clinicians. And I suppose one of the big criticisms of One Health is that it's tended to be driven by veterinarians, and I think Abigail Woods and Angela Cassidy have put the point very nicely. One Health is a bit of a grab for grants. So One Health has become this way of veterinarian epidemiologists making their work, which is of course always important, but relevant to other funding councils. So in the UK, the Medical Research Council and so on uses One Health all the time, and that's a you know, so the lobby group that brought One Health onto the agenda has of course made it you know, become some funding streams have become more amenable to this kind of work. The clinicians So that the human medical people have tended to stay away from One Health because they don't really need it for more money, and that's been one of the problems. So there are some barriers to good post or interdisciplinary arrangements along these lines. But in terms of working with others, from my own perspective, I found that biologists increasingly have a very relational view of the world, which fits entirely in with mine. So when I told that story a moment ago about the pathobiome, it seemed to me immediately that this was a fertile place to sort of talk about the social sciences, the relational social sciences. That, you know, hold on a minute, you've got all these interactions between the microbiology of ponds, but let's bring in the farmer, the market, and so on, and to think about how that. And that kind of worked. I mean, it's not without its problems, and they kind of look a bit perplexed and think, I want to get back to my metagenomic analysis. I really don't want to put the market into that. So there's always barriers to that. I won't romanticize it, but I think there's an opening there to work with people. I think we have to be very careful, obviously, about our language and so on. So this paper was read by a group I was working with who were largely epidemiologists, who kind of sent me a list of words that they needed translating and so on. And of course, it wasn't written for them, it was written for social sciences. So it's always difficult. There's always a process of translation and so on. But I think we're in a position where there are big possibilities for doing interdisciplinary work in these kind of areas. And of course it should be. But I suppose one of the pleas of this work was that we need to be transdisciplinary as well. There are a lot of knowledges out there, like the farmers in Bangladesh, like the slaughter people in the abattoirs that I've been to in the UK, that have a lot of knowledge about what's going on with animal health, that, you know, we'd be wrong not to think about them as participants in these kinds of arrangements. That's more difficult, of course, especially to get funding. You can't say, I've got an interesting alliance with a bunch of slaughter people, and here's my grant, but, you know, maybe we'll get there one day. But yeah.
Thank you very much.
Cesar, do you want to ask your question?
Steve, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. No, thank you so much. It's great to see you. Well, basically, it's kind of continuing on what other people and what you have been answering, and is the notion of pathogen. And basically, it's a notion that I've found very useful, but I would like you to develop why it's problematic for life sciences a bit more. Is it because it's relational and not describing the organism itself, or is it, well, basically, if I understand correctly, they are turning into something more relational, but I would like you to develop a bit more. And then kind of as a note, I know of someone who's Dawkins. Well, she's working with chickens and with, and basically the research she's conducting it in very close liaison with the chicken industry and getting a lot of funds from that. So that it might be a better way to go into funding than through classical paths. But that was just a note. Thank you so much.
Yes, thanks. Nice to see you. I guess the key thing, Cesar, is so this may be my background, but I come out of this. So my formative years were in the Center for Social Theory and Technology at Keele University with people like John Law and others. And that's where I got to know Anne-Marie Moles. And one of the first things they taught me is that you never be happy with a noun when you can have a verb. So my immediate response to the word pathogen was to turn it into a verb of how does something become pathogenic, and it's turned out that this kind of thinking was going on within biology as well. So there's quite a famous image on the front of Nature, I think probably about 10 years ago now, is there is no such thing as a pathogen. Okay, and that was a set of work, Casadavel, I think, and colleagues who, from a biological perspective, started to use the kind of, this is epidemiology 101, but there's no ill health or disease without the right kind of host the right kind of environment, and the right kind of microbe. Okay, those three things are all essential, and you've probably seen those Venn diagrams, the disease in the middle. And so for them, this kind of immediately labeling of anything as a pathogen was problematic, because it's about the whole process of pathogenicity that matters. And we did a book about a year after this, or 2 years after this article came out, called Pathological Lives, which I suppose captures that whole process of the making of the pathological. I think it was a line from Foucault actually as well. So, you know, you get it from all angles. So I think that's the kind of key point. It's the process of pathogenicity that matters. And when you do that, I think you get an epidemiology that's much more rooted within the situations of the present, and well, all sorts of time. It's much more rooted in the kinds of set of relations than that kind of version of epidemiology where you have these kind of, you know, self-same biological entities moving across space. Usually this is in the form of a map of air flights or something like that, saying, you know, they're all, you know, the air flights from Southeast China coming to Europe is the kind of, you know, that's where the pathogens come in, and the, you know, there's similar maps to migrations and to refugee, all that kind of nonsense of a spatial surface. What we're doing, and as a geographer, I'm interested in the taking away space from that version of space that's a surface, and started to talk about the topology, or the way in which actually pathogenicity is a folding together of hosts, environments, and microbes in particular ways. And that seems to me a much richer and more useful starting point. And I've started to use the term a deracinated epidemiology, an epidemiology that has that kind of feel of the kinds of complexities and foldings of what's going on in reality. So probably that's not the greatest answer to your question, but hopefully it gets at some of the issue. That's not to say, of course, that microbes aren't dangerous. It goes back to the more than one, less than many of kind of, you know, when pathogenicity has been affected, then of course, you know, I'm not sort of wishing away SARS. I'm not a kind of, you know, denialist or vaccine hesitant person. There's a kind of key set of issues here, but I think we need to understand process. And I work, some of you may know John Dupre, who's at Exeter University, similarly, and of course some of the people you've had in your discussions, people like Celia Lowe and so on, talks about the viral clouds and so on. I think we're all on the same page in thinking about microorganisms as kind of flows, as kind of clouds, as kind of process. I mean, these are all words for me to talk about process. So I think that's the key issue. Sorry, what was the other question, Cesar? Oh, it's all right, okay.
And I should have said too, we've had some conversations with Hannah Landecker and Tony Hatch about both how historical process in intergenerational terms gets molecularized to create certain sorts of susceptibilities that inherit legacies of racism and colonialism. So the overexpression of ACE2 receptors becomes an adaptive response in the context of metabolic epidemics, which sort of interfaces with viral pandemics. But yeah, I hear a lot of really interesting resonances between what you're saying just now about pathogenicity and these becoming with relational terms and those earlier discussions we had. Melanie, do you want to jump in with your question about the genealogy of One Health?
Yeah, sure. I think Katrina also had a question and we jumped over it, but let me just quickly ask mine. Reading your paper, I was wondering again how much older colonial networks were just kind of like merged into One Health. And I mean, Eamon started with a joke about One Health as being a kumbaya approach, but I wonder like how much is it actually a kumbaya approach? I think also a couple of weeks ago, we had Jakob Zinstag from the Swiss Tropical Health Institute presenting, which, I mean, the Swiss Tropical Health Institute being a major player in One Health. And they used to be a mission, they come out of a mission background, like as the medical part of a mission, the Basel Mission Society. I'm always wondering how much this kumbaya approach is actually present, but not really spoken about, because it's like further back in a longer history than the brief history you mentioned.
Yeah, I don't. I think I'd refer you to Abigail Woods, who's done a nice history of the term. So I think there's a book of her team that does a longer history than I was able to. And Jakob, of course, will know some of the history as well and be quite self-critical about these kinds of processes. I think One World, One Health clearly has resonances with global health and international health, and it, you know, and that does have that kind of colonial health. Certainly, the people I've found who have been most positive about some of the One Health possibilities are those who are working in you know, post-colonial context, I guess. So that's certainly part of this, and I certainly think with the history. So the only bit of history I do in this is that kind of moment of, I guess, early 2000s. You know, emerging, so SARS and other kinds of issues, and then the whole worries about emerging zoonoses, maybe a little bit earlier with so the 1990s work of viral traffic and those kind of ideas. So all those come together, and those were generated very strongly out of a kind of what someone like Nicholas King would talk about, the kind of, it wasn't the kind of concern about the health in the colonies, it was the concern about the kind of distinction between there and here was no longer as robust as it was. So it was that kind of global hope moment of global communicability, wasn't it? It was the kind of, it was those maps of the kind of international flights, the compressed time horizons between travelers, you know. So the SARS moment was key here, I think, as well. So there is a version, there's a fear of global trends. Of course, we're living through it at the moment, but there was that fear of the global pandemic and the global fear, which I think was as much the driver of this as the other model of kind of, you know, the enclave or the colonial health issue. I think so, but you know, these are all wrapped up, and I think it would need to be teased out and worked out. And I think you could probably pick through some of the key articles or pieces of research that have used the One Health mantra and start to work out what the kinds of key narratives, key discourses, key kinds of issues that are in play are. I think that would be a really useful thing to do.
Katrina, did we miss you earlier, or did you already get a chance to ask your question?
No, I just use fidgeting to think with, so sorry about that.
Cool. So Anne and Stephanie, you have a question in the chat.
Yeah, so on page 30, you write, so the extension of a global modern agriculture from the core to a periphery in the form of disease-free zones is just one example of this pursuit of a single biosecure planet, which manages to produce two worlds, a global north of self-controlling virtuous economic actors and a south of interspecies intimacy and contingency, end quote. And so this dynamic between the global north and global south seems to rest on a balance of a current world population. But how will the one world, one health change, given that we have an increasing world population density and also an increasing demand in meat consumption? So how will this one world, one health change, given that in 2050 we have a prediction that we have around 10 billion people on the planet? How do you see this dynamic between the global north and global south changing?
Yeah, I know it's a good question. I don't know whether it's about absolute numbers, but I think there's something that's here about what's happened in this bipolar world seems a bit dated now as well. It's still there, and I think the examples I've talked about today about what was going on in India, Bangladesh, and so on, that kind of, the assumption that there's a good way or virtuous way of self-controlling virtuous economic actors versus interspecies intimacy is still out there, and I've really noticed it in responses and reactions. And I've been with delegations from the British government to Bangladesh to talk about these kinds of things and so on. And that kind of post-colonial superiority is still there and still utterly embarrassing, and I hate it, and it's really hard to do field work when you're in those kind of situations. But I think what's going on, if I can carry on talking about Bangladesh a little bit, is that the bipolar world of north-south is changing so quickly. So the key issue now is not whether Britain's got any influence over what's going on farms in India through the government or whatever. And of course, there are bits of funding and so on, and that happens a little bit. The key influence is clearly what's going on in Bangladesh's relationship to China and so on. And that's where the market for a lot of this produce is. And China is cleaning up its act, for example, around things like antimicrobials in farming to an extent, but in the way that the markets are growing for imports of food from states in Africa as well as Asia to China, it's a very different kind of dynamic. So if you have market or consumer-driven governance of food production in India and Bangladesh, so you have labeling and so on to say, low in antibiotics use, or it's has certain kind of labor relations and so on. All that kind of changes to the way, consumer-driven changes down the value chain to markets, and to that somehow impact on the farms in India, and that some of that's got a kind of One Health element to it. In fact, there's a One Health label now on goods in America, isn't there? I think there's some contestation around it, but there's a kind of new sticker just to go with all the other stickers that you have on your food. There's a One Health one in the US. That's going to change very rapidly as as South-South or trade between middle-income countries or or different kinds of arrangements of trade happen. So I think that's the key issue, and I think you're also right to flag up meat consumption. That's clearly a massive issue here. Is that the quickest way to kind of solve a lot of these problems is, of course, to reduce meat consumption massively, and that's one of the key aims of all this, is that we can't have this level of, what is it, something like 70 billion chickens killed every year worldwide for human consumption. It's just an incredible amount of birds, and if you have that, then you're clearly going to have whatever biosecurity you have, you're going to have the kinds of issues that I've talked about.
Thank you. I had a
Sort
question.
of on a related note. Oh, go ahead, Rachel. Yeah.
Thanks so much for your paper, Stephen. I was thinking about the point at which you wrote about capital intensive agriculture models, and you were mentioning your latest field research, and kind of the trend towards relying heavily on monocrop or monoculture patterning. And I was, thinking a lot about some of the gender-based critiques of the One Health model that I've read through, and was thinking about maybe in the early 2000s, FAO and the World Health Organization came out with these sort of gender equity sort of analyses in global agriculture. And what strikes me is that they are still very much, they're very production driven, much like some of the things that you've pointed out today. And I'm just curious, what your sense is. When Jakob came to speak with us, he actually mentioned and actually showed us some of his own photographs of some meetings that they had held, in which local representatives were being more increasingly integrated into the processes. But I wonder still about the gender equity dynamics that were sort of started in the early and mid 2000s, in which, well, equity is good because look how much more we can produce, and it's just capital intensive narrative and very production driven. So I'm curious, what's your sense, since you've done so much extensive field work, and that you occupy these very interesting and dynamic roles in your professional life? What's your, between multiple worlds, what's your sense of the, is there a shifting conversation about this? What's your sense of the application of it, or the how it's being implemented?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and I don't think I've got anything like a simple answer. And it almost varies by sector. So some of the, I mean, NGOs, so someone like Bangladesh, for example, to take that as a starting point, it's well known that, you know, Bangladesh, I mean, it's an interesting, it's governed pretty robustly, and you know the government has certain kind of things that it does, but NGOs have been really significant in Bangladesh, and what I've noticed is that the gender is a massive issue in the constitution of all the, and I've worked with a number of NGOs in Bangladesh over the last few years. Gender equality is a massive issue in their terms, and so that's been really quite interesting. In the kind of, that's the kind of, you know, absolute thing that you that no one will question, and it's kind of interesting in a Muslim country, because when you're in the field, there are certain jobs and so on that women aren't expected to do. So in aquaculture, for example, is regarded largely as men's work, because you know, for a whole set of cultural issues and so on. But when we then went to do work with chickens, and this was partly with the FAO in Bangladesh, that was quite fun, because that was very much women's role. And in fact, if any man came to us, so we had local meetings, a bit like Jacob does, where we kind of mapped disease, you know, and kind of got women to use sort of counters for how many diseases each farm had and so on. We built up this kind of lay epidemiology of the issue. And if any of the men kind of the village walked in at that point, they were kind of kept away, because, you know, and they were just regarded as kind of not really having any role at all in kind of these kind of issues of looking after animal health and so on. So it just really struck me there was interesting sectoral or food production differences that I needed to know a little bit more about the culture and the history of the nation state, maybe of the religion as it's practiced in that country and so on, which we didn't have time to do. So there were those kind of issues. So that's one element within the production and animal care side. And I know all the NGOs who are working in Bangladesh really conceive of gender relations as absolutely key, and gender opportunities as absolutely key in terms of rural development. So they all know that kind of issue. And I don't think it's just about production, and I don't think it's just about essentialized kind of versions of gender either, in terms of animal care or health or welfare and so on. I think there's a kind of whole set of things coming together, but there are some pretty significant structures within Bangladesh society in terms of men and women and violence, all those kinds of things that are also key issues. So that's quite a complicated situation. I guess I don't really know. I mean, a lot of the kind of female employment in the sectors that I talked about is in poorly paid food processing jobs. So if a sector rolls out the aquaculture sector does, in the countries I've worked at, roll out kind of you know, the number of men and women employed in the sector, then you do see quite a lot of women, but the women are all in basically the kind of the freezer plants and so on, the processing, the kind of shelling and those kind of things. So there's kind of massive issues there in terms of exploitation of different kinds of labours as well. So I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, it's partly there's intent and the kind of the logic in those NGOs, and that's fed down, I think, from FAO and World Health Organization. The OIE are quite good at making sure this is a key issue, and certainly with field workers in FAO, they'd make sure that there's that the gender issues are taken into account. For example, we made sure we had women only. There are aquaculture farmers, so when we did workshops and did some lay epidemiology and mapping of disease and resistance risks, we had women only groups and those kinds of things. So that happens, but there is of course, as you know, an awful long way to go in terms of thinking about the other kinds of dimensions of these kinds of issues. Does that answer your question? I'm not quite sure.
Yes, thanks. I think it extends quite a bit, and it I think gives me a lot more food for thought in thinking more. I like that you use the term intention as well, because as the push towards you know, capital intensive dynamics continues or increases, I imagine this will the conversation will grow and extend as well. I'll be curious to follow.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, in Bangladesh, for example, you're going back to Bangladesh, where I know most at the moment, obviously the big export earner for the country is the ready-made garment sector, where, as you probably know, it's kind of mass employment of rural women go to Dakar and work in these huge factories with sometimes poor regulation and so on. So doing that kind of work, as the food sector intensifies, you can get the same kind of issues, is that the number of jobs in agriculture or food production expand, and a lot of those become about, you know, rural families sending away their daughters to work in these processing factories. If they're not being sent to Dakar to kind of sew jeans, then they're being sent to Khulna or to one of the ports to kind of process the produce from you know, or the chicken production, whatever, and produce processed meat, which then gets sent to China and other places as much as it does to northern markets. So yeah,
thanks so much, Steve. This has been a really enlightening conversation. Yeah, it's been a delight to engage with your work. So thank you for visiting. Apologies for my bad internet connection. Next week at a different time, morning time in Australia, late at night in Europe, we're going to talk with Andrew Lakoff. But again, Steve, thanks again. This is a super smart article, and I think gives us a lot of resources to go forward as we think about One Health and these global assemblages that you've been studying. So thanks, and can't wait to read more.
Thank you. That's a privilege to have those questions. Thank you very much. Thanks for the time.
Thanks, Stephen.
All right. Bye.
Good to see you, everybody. Bye.
Bye, everyone.